So hello, I'm Chris Sullivan. I'm the CEO of NIMI. With me is Tim Callahan, the global CISO for Aflac. And we certainly want to start by expressing our appreciation for your time. Give us an opportunity to talk to some of the things we've been working on. I will tell you, just as a bit of background, over the years, Tim and I have worked together on many sort of innovative projects, with sort of nascent problems within the industry. It's got to be 15, 20 years ago, on the very first project at our very first meeting, Tim told me that if we failed, he would get fired. And he assured me that if he got fired, I would get fired as well. So that sort of set the tone. But I think over the years, we've had a very successful partnership. And today we're going to talk to you more about sort of digitizing the active workforce. So next slide, Tim. Thanks. So yeah, we're going to talk about our experience in connecting the workforce in a manner that, from a security and privacy perspective, is very strong, also provides resiliency, and value across, the rest of the executive suite. There is a bit of a nod to the pandemic, and the use case that we'll talk about is COVID, since that's current. But this is really not about pandemic response. There was actually a CDC campaign in around 2012 that Tim connected to, and I think he'll, or had a connection with, and I think he'll talk more about that. But the idea was the CDC came out and said, imagine anything that can happen. Imagine if there was a zombie apocalypse, and that was the campaign, preparing for the zombie apocalypse. But that really leads you to, how do you prepare for anything to happen? How do you prepare for, sort of in Donald Rumsfeld terms, unknown unknowns coming at you? And that's sort of the purpose of the talk today. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Tim. He can talk about a little bit of the context for this at Aflac.
Yeah, I will. First, I want to walk a little bit through history and the history of the information security program and the model. And I've been fortunate to have worked in information security for a long time, as Sully pointed out. But I can remember when it was all about compliance. I worked for a bank after my military career. I worked for a bank. And, our biggest emphasis at the time was make sure that we were regulatory compliant, that we could continue to operate a bank without any kind of regulatory structures. Not that we weren't worried about security, it's just the threat, was not as looming then as it is now. So we were very focused on compliance. And then the threat started to increase. And we did, in fact, find out, like many companies did, that compliance and security are not necessarily the same thing. That you can be compliant, but not necessarily have a good security program. So again, the industry started shifting, and we shifted into more maintaining our compliance. Certainly that's table stakes to be in business, especially for regulated entities, but making sure that we could protect our environment as well. And then we started talking about maturity and maturation and how to measure that. And, if you're going to be compliant, if you're going to be secure, how do you know that? And so we talked about frameworks and maturity models and things like that in order to do that. And then we started, after many breaches in the US, you started to thinking about defensibility. What does that mean? How would I defend this decision if something bad were to happen? So not that drove the program, but it was always kind of in the back of the mind. And now we're entering a time where we're really emphasizing cyber resiliency. And that's really, acknowledging we can get attacked, we will get attacked, we may even suffer a type of a breach, but being resilient enough to be able to take that, absorb that, and continue business through that. A good friend of mine, Richard A. Clark, was talking at a conference. He and his co-author Robert Nackey just published a book about a year ago called The Fifth Domain. And they really introduced this concept of cyber resiliency. And like all of us have heard the quote about, there's two kind of companies, the ones that have been breached and know about it, the ones that have not been breached and didn't know about it. But what they introduced is the third type of company. And in their book, The Fifth Domain, they did research on all kinds of companies. And they found that the cyber resilient firm was the one that suffers little or no damage when they are hacked, when they are penetrated. And they gave multiple examples of that. So that's really, and one reason that we're shifting towards that is to provide that good business background. Sully, I'm going to pass this back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. So what are the keys to resiliency? Resiliency, I would think about as the ability to handle those sort of known unknowns and even unknown unknowns. So it is a form of agility, but not a sort of special case for agility. The important thing is to build out a solution that is going to deal with things like security and privacy in a way that you can respond quickly, right? So again, it's a form of agility, if you will. And that means you can't build bespoke solutions, meaning I want to solve, for this specific problem, I want to use this approach. For that specific problem, I want to use that approach, because that is inherently sort of difficult to change. So we want to embrace these philosophies of we have to be able to deal with change. We want to build a service that we can respond with. That's the fundamental point. So there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, when we kind of peel that back, and this presentation is about how we at Aflac have kind of gone through this journey. We adopted the all hazards approach in 2017, and it was really from experience I had at my previous company, as Sully had talked about, when the CDC launched this zombie apocalypse campaign. I was with another company responsible for crisis management, as I am at my present company, and in adopting this all hazards approach really gives us the flexibility. It really creates an environment of resiliency, because what we find is that most hazards have similar things in common, whether it's a physical, a logical, whatever. Some of the things that it have in common is that, just getting up to speed very early in the process is important. I refer to that as the fog of war, right? In the early stages of anything, you find that there's disinformation, sometimes intentional by a criminal element, sometimes it's unintentional, but there is this figuring out what's really there. Well, the all hazards approach accommodates that. And then you have different scenarios for different types of events, but it embraces the commonality. We shifted back in 2017. We shifted from a facility-centric model of recovery to one of a work anywhere. Now, when we did that, we had in mind several events, this all hazards approach. One of them was, in fact, a pandemic. And we found out that in this pandemic, we were able to mobilize our teams to an out of work from home, work from anywhere kind of model very rapidly, because we had planned for that. We had installed the technology, the security, we had exercised it, so we were able to mobilize fairly quickly. Not that we didn't, have some lessons learned, but a lot of the kinds of things that we had planned for instance, not totally related, but very beneficial, is we had really been on a campaign for both the environment, for security reasons, of emphasizing a paperless work process. And many companies that I've talked to, one of the biggest things, especially one like ours, where it's kind of a claims process, there's a a workflow kind of process. Oftentimes they were very heavily dependent on paper. We benefited because we had started breaking our dependence on paper. And again, it was a conscious, intentional thing to do that we reaped benefit from. But that really speaks of resiliency and how we did that. And then what we found is that we had all kinds of security tools in our environment. We had a very mature threat intelligence platform. We had a data aggregation platform in order to help inform that threat intelligence mechanism. We had a process where we ingested logs from our physical access badging system. We ingested logs from machines, from the internet, et cetera. So we were able to use that and leverage that in a digital way in order to inform us. For instance, when our main area, where our main campus is, when they imposed the strictest restrictions on shelter in place, we had to evacuate our buildings, so to speak. And in order to monitor that and see how well we were doing and how well our employees were logging on and how well they were working, we were able to leverage this digital environment that we had built. We monitored how many people were still badging into the buildings. We monitored who was coming up online from a remote capacity. And we were able to monitor the quality of their service, those kinds of things, in order to make adjustments throughout. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Sully.
Sure, thanks, Tim. So we can go to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about maybe putting some meat on the bones. We talked about the complexity of, or the challenge of dealing with complexity, especially when there's unknowns. And if you think about the way we solve, just driving this back to a CISO's perspective, the way we solve access problems today, unfortunately, we do it in point solutions kind of fashion. So we think about physical access controls getting into buildings. There's typically a card system for that. Some are more secure than others. That's sort of one physical control point. We think about what you do to lock a terminal. It's typically a timeout. That's a classic trade-off with sort of the friction imposed on the workers to get stronger security. So I'm going to lock your terminal if it's inactive. That's pretty easy to beat. If you walk away from the terminal, for me to keep either your mouse or your keyboard active, I could just put your mouse on an analog watch. It'll stay active. So it's not very secure. And again, it imposes some burden on the system. People are in different places with respect to multi-factor authentication. Do I use that just for privileged access management systems? Do I do passwordless logons? Am I trying to do passwordless logons? So, in the net of it is just talking about this, this sort of CISO's problem of how do I identify, that this is the right person doing the right thing at the right time. It's very difficult. There's lots of different systems involved. That makes agility or resiliency more difficult. And it also puts a burden on the user. I use different systems and UIs for these different things. So that's sort of state of the union, the way most companies approach the problem today. What we're advocating, next slide, please, Tim, is that you think about that differently. You think about, I have problems that I have to solve. If I solve it one time for the enterprise, then I can do that in a much, much better way. So if I think about replacing all of these discrete or bespoke solutions to say, I need to know how to identify that person and be assured that it's them. In Tim's example of, shelter in place with the initial phases of the pandemic response, that means I need to know that it's really you at the edge of the network and you're not sitting in your office anymore. You might be sitting in Starbucks. You might be sitting at home. So it's a different kind of challenge. And so what we're advocating and what we're building out together today is there's a service, if you will, that when you connect the worker to the work space, you get a service that's independent of location. Think about the zero trust model, Beyond Corp, that kind of stuff, in that it provides a a uniform level of privacy, a uniform level of security, and really a natural user experience, regardless of which systems you're logging into or which domains you're logging into, or what have you. So it's a bit more difficult to think about, that next use case that you want to solve, but I think you'll see it's a far more powerful and agile and, and by dint of that, resilient way to go about the world. I think about this, 25 years ago, I was building global router networks for major financials. And what had happened there is everybody connected to different, they started connecting work groups together. They, then they had a finance group, and then they had some other groups. Then they started connecting them together in this bespoke fashion. Eventually, the networks got very fragile and very difficult to change. And we almost flipped. There was like a moment in the industry where everyone just started building these global router networks. It was a service to connect computing to the network. You didn't have to think about it if you were in Kuala Lumpur or New York City or what have you, right? So I think about connecting the worker. We think about connecting the worker as much the same idea. Do it once, do it correctly. You get efficiency and scale and resiliency. So these are things you might think about when you're connecting the worker. The first bit is, how do I know that it's you? And again, in the pandemic space, that changed a lot, because now I have to say, how do I know that it's you at home? I do know, not Aflac, of course, but I do know many companies, when that happened, they had to file exceptions with respect to their security controls because they didn't have that sort of resiliency in place. So knowing that it's you is important. I would say, from our experience, knowing your location relative to a system, your location relative to another person, your location relative to the enterprise. Those are important things as well. Just quickly on that, if you think about that challenge of all companies have policies to lock a screen after a certain amount of time, again, that to improve security, we're imposing an imposition on the worker, on the teammate. What you could do is take some of these things like activity. I just stood up and took 3 steps away. Location, that's the away. There's a distance there. You can infer from that myself or Tim, we just stood up and walked away from our terminal. You might lock the terminal. Otherwise, if you know that I'm there, you don't have to lock the terminal. It's not a matter of the timeout, and so there's no friction for the user, and it's actually a much more appropriate control. Going forward, if you think about the extensibility of this platform beyond the CISO's office, you might think about health and safety as well. So you can think about temperature and vital signs. That can lead you to things, even for knowledge workers, financial services, what have you, or manufacturing, worker fatigue. On a manufacturing line, there are injuries, but for knowledge workers, there are mistakes. So if you can pick up on workers getting fatigued and not off, maybe give them a little bump, that could be helpful. And then finally, two-way communication with the worker. Those are what we think about as the basic services you want to provide. And as you'll see, when we come back to it, when you start to put those together, like standing up and walking away in distance, that actually improves the security control. So, always, security and privacy and a very nasty user experience. Those are things you're gonna have to focus on. Otherwise, the users won't adopt them. The CISO will reject them, but the users won't adopt them if it's not a very clean, simple experience. Thanks, Tim. So this is just one example in COVID. We also talked a bit about just a different event, like the freezing in Texas, puts a different imposition on people. But if you have those tenets in place, identity, I know that it's you, location, activity, what have you, then you can start to build up some solutions so you can solve problems like social distancing, contact tracing, but also I know that it's you that did this at the station, says I feel well today before I come into the office, haven't been in touch with someone from COVID, or I'm working from home, you know that it's me at the edge of the network. So when you start to, or I want to come into the office, but I am healthy, I'm not running a temperature. So you start to combine these things together, and I think Tim will give a specific example of things we're doing at Aflac. Then you'll see how these different components provide almost a 1 + 1 = 3, a better solution for different use cases, whether they're security use cases or otherwise.
So when we kind of start talking about, when we started talking about, I should say, using a wearable device to start accomplishing this, we really kind of reversed our way into it. It's like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? The immediate problem that we're trying to solve, obviously in a COVID environment, was how do we bring our workforce back into the campus safely, and then kind of looking at it from a perspective of what other benefits we could derive from that. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring this up and kind of talk about it as one picture, although they seem like discrete events. Our number one use case actually turned out to be the contact tracing, but through that we were able to accomplish some other things. And so when we talk about bringing the worker back on campus, right now we have a limited number of people coming back on campus or never did leave, some essential workers that couldn't do their job off campus. The process is that they come to a control point. A physical security guard uses a temperature checker to check their temperature. They have a self-attestation that they do about their health. And then from that, they're admitted into the building. Once they're in the building, we really don't have any contact with them, from a logical standpoint. So as we were looking at the wearable device, we were looking at it from, well, one, how can we solve that problem too? The fact that we, once they're in the building, we don't know. And then how can we more systemically, obviously, when we're talking about bringing the thousands back on, we're not going to have a guard take their temperature. That you can imagine the long lines, the queues that would be building up behind that. We can do the self-attestation, but the self-attestation, again, is a point in time and, would not necessarily detect deviations. So as we looked at the wearable, it started solving several of our problems. One, physical access into the building. The wearable can detect some signs, some, symptoms, if you will, of maybe someone being ill, and we can deny access if it triggers on that. We can, again, use it so that when someone's in the building already, had checked through, if something occurs, for instance, we see some other physiological event with the individual, we can detect that. The contact tracing, if two workers get in proximity of others, we can notify you're within that zone, that too close zone, but also record that contact so that if later someone else has a symptom, then we can take care of that as well. What we can do in building out the bigger picture also is it really starts creating a life cycle. For instance, in our buildings, we have multi-factor authentication in normal time. So you badge in and then you punch in a code. Well, obviously during COVID, we don't want people touching the keypad, so we turn that off. Well, with this capability, we can actually use the wearable device to take a biometric signature and to detect, like I said, they're okay to go in. We can allow them to go in, and it provides that multi-factor authentication inherently. We can also look at, once we have that, we've been able to use that to start making the employee's life better too, through the ability to log onto your computer, as Sully pointed out. We had again, part of our paperless drive was that we put a secure print capability in. So people would really have to think, do I want to get up and authenticate to the printer? And that gave us capability to also track who was using printers most so that we could look at workflows that could help those people. We weren't trying to trap them, we were trying to help them. We also, in our facilities, we have vending machines, technology vending machines. So those little things that, you know, a mouse or whatever, that people just, employees, they can go to this vending machine and self-service. So by having this wearable, it starts giving us all of these capabilities in order to, one, keep the employees safe, keep our security, our logical security safe, through a seamless, transparent multi-factor, but also make the employee's life better.
So just on that, Tim, you know, so there's a couple of overlay use cases that you talked about there. One is social distancing, contact tracing. Two is, you know, sort of unified security across, you know, vending machines, secure printing, physical access, logical access, you know, and it's all the same user experience. But then, you know, they might not seem to intersect, but where, you know, you either haven't had a valid attestation which says, I feel well today, I haven't touched someone with COVID, or you have an elevated temperature, that's where having physical access, you know, joining that extra point allows us to keep you from getting in the building without having security guards at every door. So my expectation is that'll have a significant impact on your just your normal operations. I mean, normally, I don't know how many doors you have access to, but you wouldn't want to have a physical security guard at every door for the social distancing.
Well, and that's a very good point, Sally, because right now, you know, we're having to funnel all people into, you know, one entry point, so to speak, because that's where the guard is, right? With this capability, we're able to open back up those multiple doors. Like, you know, one facility may have 8 entry points. The one I work in has 8 entry points right now that's funneled to one. Well, you know, as we bring people back on campus in this quasi post-COVID environment, you know, we can't have 2,000 people in the morning trying to get through that one door. So this gives us the capability to open back up as well.
Yeah.
Some of the,
sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to go through some of the comments, so, but go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the other thing that previous slide points out is that there's just so many things we're asking the user to keep track of in that world where we say we're going to build all these solutions and impose them on the worker, rather than saying we're going to take a worker-centric solution and figure out how to connect out to all these different ways. So it's a different way to shake, you know, the tree, if you will, but you know, you're taking away a lot of complexity. That's
yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to obviously read this to the audience. It's been up here; they can read this. But you know, the user, when we first started talking about, you know, putting a wearable on a user, we had some concerns. You know, there were privacy concerns. There were, are these people tracking me? Those kinds of things. What, you know, is very legitimate. I'm not making light of that. But as we ran this through a pilot group of, I don't know, about 80, 100 people, what they found out is it really does make your life easier. I mean, it enables you to do things, having to remember to lock your keyboard. When you go to your computer, having it log you in based on your biometric signature. The ability for us to make sure it's secure, because, you know, one of the first things that popped up is, oh, well, I'll just give my band to someone else. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. If it's not you, it doesn't work. So it's not like a badge where you can give it to someone and they can use it to get into the building. Or in some of our penetration tests, we had seen where you know, our penetrators, our testers were able to duplicate the badge. That's one of the reasons we went to multi-factor. So it solves all this in a way that's not burdensome to the employee. And anytime security can make life better for an employee, I think that's an advantage. And then, you know, across the team. So again, in the security realm, we often do things and the rest of the company looks, oh, those are those crazy security guys. They're requiring this. But in this case, we've been able to solve multiple problems. And even our app development team is a little bit excited about this because some of the things that they've had to go through for access controls that, obviously we impose, we can do that through transparent access, through the band, the wearable, the authentication, knowing that who it is, not having to go through other steps to do that. Privacy was a big issue. Again, we've solved that. I mean, the wearable accommodates privacy. There's all kinds of options depending on even local privacy rules if you need to do that. So, I think it's one of those situations where it's just a really good solution that we're able to accommodate a lot of different people's interests.
If I may, Tim, I mean, we could go around the wheel. HR is that uniform, it's a uniform experience for everybody, health and safety, what have you. One of the ones that's been really interesting for us is digital transformation. So today, first of all, if you're going to do this, if you're going to take this connected work approach, then you really, really need to think hard about privacy. And we'd certainly advocate you look at privacy by design. It comes out of the Ontario government, but it's the basis for GDPR, basis for the California Privacy Act. Make things transparent to the user, give them the option opt in and out, give them the right to forget, et cetera. So if you look at that as sort of design principles for privacy, if you can provide that privacy layer about what the worker's doing, then you give a really unique opportunity to digital transformation people. They might want to know what the workers are doing. They may or may not have the rights to know that, right? But if you implement this privacy layer correctly, so it's not just the security layer, and especially for national companies, you can say, okay, in the U.S., do I have the rights to this data? In Germany, do I have the rights to this data? And what kind of data? And on basis on that individual, it really changes things. So today, what you would normally do, a DX initiative, digital transformation initiative, you normally go out and say, I want to collect data about the workers. I'm going to go out to when are they badging in? When are they tapping this on this system? What have you? Then you'd have to bring it back to a data lake, curate it, make sure the clocks are synchronized so you don't infer the wrong things. But then you'd have to ask the question, do I have the rights to even look and see that data, right? If you implement this correctly, essentially you have a virtualized data lake. It's completely curated for you. All the data about the worker is current, and you know if you have the rights to use it or not. So a DX person doesn't have to go out and collect all this information. They can just sit in their cube or at home today, what have you, and go at it. So that's one example, but you could go all around the wheel.
And as I've offered some of the examples, what it does is, again, it contributes to our resiliency because there's so many things that we can do with the data now. I mean, if we wanted to, I could track, this is an employee, they badged into this building with their wearable, they walked right in. These are the points they went into the building, right? So if an employee were, infected, we could know where they went, but also we could tell when they badge in that they went to their computer. So we could put that person in the place of their computer, which again, we can use that as part of our authentication authorization mechanisms and detect if someone is trying to log in as that person, but they're not there. So that gives us just more capability around that. Well, Sally, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just wrap us up here.
Sure. So I guess thematically what we're advocating here is that you just take a unified approach to connecting the worker. You think about security, you think about privacy, you think about an attribute access as sort of the primitives to that, or necessary functionality or layers to that. And then you could do other things like location and health and safety, what have you. When you think about that, we think about, say, the work at Aflac. When you solve the problem once for many different applications, you're allowed to do that better. So, Tim, I might ask, the level of security that we will have for an individual at Aflac is is probably higher than for any access to any of the system's applications, or in terms of identifying and assuring that it's them. Any applications or doors or anything will be higher. When we finish this, it'll be higher than it was for anything prior to that. Now, there's other controls in place like privileged access management. In terms of that, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is, and it's not only making that assertion, but being to validate that assertion electronically, which is always important. You know, it gets back to our concept of defensibility. I may have a control, but can I really prove that that control works? And this gives us, on so many levels, the defensibility there.
Yeah. So I would say, I mean, so you can provide much better privacy, much better security for really much less effort. And then by separating those things, you know, by separating the worker from all these back end systems, you also have more agility. You can make changes under the covers. The user doesn't even see it. So that actually sets you up for resiliency. So certainly that's what we're advocating. In the first steps, you might think about, should I really be going down this course? In the second step, if I do go down the course, you know, what kind of business case can I make for that? Can I retire badges? Can I get rid of passwords finally? You know, can I get rid of additional fobs for multi-factor and all the complexity behind that? You start to think about the business case, putting that together, and then execute it. So those would be, I think, the key takeaways and next steps.
Okay. Well, that kind of wraps us up. And again, we thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. This is a use case that we have found valuable. And certainly I'm on LinkedIn if anybody wants to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.